Hey night traveler, welcome to the Stealth Podcast. Here, you'll hear chilling stories to help you drift off or keep you awake. If you're into that vibe, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, kill the lights, put your headphones on, and let's hit the road. I thought parking my van in the Appalachian wilderness would give me peace and a break from city life. What I didn't know was that some places in those mountains aren't meant for outsiders, especially not at night. The locals had their reasons for the warnings they gave me, reasons rooted in old myths I should have taken seriously. What started as a simple overnight stay turned into the most horrifying experience of my life, one that made me question everything I thought I knew about what's real and what's just legend. My name is Vera Holcomb. I'm 43 years old, and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. I've been doing this van life thing for about 2 years now, converting my old Ford Transit into a cozy little home on wheels after my divorce left me wanting nothing more than distance from everything familiar. My best friend, Darcy, thinks I'm crazy for living this way, but she doesn't understand the freedom it gives me. She's got her corporate job and her condo and her routine, and that's fine for her. Me? I needed something different, something that felt alive. That's what brought me to the Appalachian Mountains in late October, chasing fall colors and that crisp mountain air that makes you feel like you can breathe again. I'd been driving through western North Carolina for 3 days when I rolled into a small town called Millbrook. And I mean small, like blink and you miss it small. One gas station, a diner that looked like it hadn't updated its menu since 1987, and maybe 20 houses scattered along the main road. I stopped at the gas station to fill up and grab some supplies, and that's where I met Earl, this weathered old guy who worked the counter. He had to be pushing 70, with hands that looked like tree bark and eyes that seemed to look right through you. When I mentioned I was planning to park my van up near Whisper Hollow for the night, I'd found the spot on some overlanding app. His whole demeanor changed. "You don't want to go up there," he said, not even looking at me, just bagging my beef jerky and trail mix like he was talking about the weather. "Folks around here know better." I laughed it off, thinking he was just being dramatic the way small-town people sometimes are about outsiders. "I'll be fine," I told him. "I've camped in plenty of remote spots before." But Earl wasn't having it. He leaned in close, and I could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "It ain't about remote," he said quietly. "It's about what's up there. The old folks talk about the Nunahai, spirits that live in those mountains, been there long before any of us. And there's something else too, something that walks on 2 legs, but ain't quite human. Not anymore." He went on about how people who ignored the warnings sometimes came back different, if they came back at all. How there were sounds in those woods that didn't match any animal known to science. How the Cherokee people who first lived here had marked certain places as forbidden, and Whisper Hollow was one of them. I thanked him for his concern, paid for my stuff, and walked out thinking the isolation had made him a little paranoid. The drive up to Whisper Hollow took about 40 minutes on increasingly rough roads, the kind that make you grateful for high clearance and all-wheel drive. The trees got denser as I climbed, their branches creating this tunnel effect that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. The GPS on my phone lost signal about halfway up, but I downloaded the offline maps, so I kept going. When I finally reached the clearing, this beautiful spot overlooking a valley with mountains rolling out in every direction, I felt vindicated. This was exactly what I'd been looking for. Nobody around for miles. Just me and nature, and the kind of silence that's so complete it almost rings in your ears. I parked the van facing the valley view, leveled it out, and started my usual evening routine, making dinner on my little propane stove, setting up my solar lights, checking that everything was secure. The sun was setting, painting the sky in these incredible shades of orange and purple, and I remember thinking Earl was out of his mind for trying to scare me away from this place. But as darkness fell, and I mean really fell, that complete blackness you only get in places far from any light pollution, something felt off. The silence I'd appreciated earlier started feeling wrong, oppressive even. In all my camping experiences, there's always some noise. Crickets, owls, wind through the leaves, something. But here, nothing. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the creeping unease, telling myself I was just letting Earl's weird warnings get into my head. I made some tea, settled into my bed at the back of the van with a book, and decided to call it an early night. That's when I heard it. Not a footstep or a shadow or any of that typical scary stuff. but a sound that made my blood run cold. It was singing, faint and distant, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. A woman's voice, high and haunting, singing in a language I didn't recognize. And the worst part? It was getting closer. I sat frozen in my bed, every muscle in my body locked up as that singing drifted closer through the darkness. It wasn't like any melody I'd ever heard. The notes bent and wavered in ways that seemed almost impossible, like the voice was coming from multiple directions at once. My rational brain tried to explain it away. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks, or some hiker with a radio. Or hell, maybe I was more tired than I thought and imagining things. But deep down, in that primal part of your brain that kept our ancestors alive, I knew something was wrong. The singing would fade for a moment, and I'd start to relax. Then it would surge back louder, closer, making the hair on my arms stand straight up. I grabbed my phone to check the time, 9:47 p.m., and saw I had no signal, not even emergency calls. Great. Just perfect. After about 20 minutes of this, the singing stopped completely, cut off mid-note like someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could hear myself breathing too fast, too shallow. I forced myself to move, crawling to the front of the van to peer out the windshield. The solar lights I'd set up outside cast these weak pools of yellow light that barely pushed back the darkness, and beyond them, nothing but black. I stared out into that void for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, looking for any movement, any sign of what had made that sound. That's when I saw her, or it, standing just at the edge of my light's reach. A figure, definitely humanoid, but taller than any person should be. At first I thought it was a trick of the shadows, my eyes making shapes out of nothing, but then it moved. Not walked, moved. It swayed side to side in this unnatural way, like a tree in the wind, but there was no wind. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my phone, but I managed to turn on the flashlight and shine it toward the figure. For just a second, I saw it clearly, and I wished to God I hadn't. It looked like a woman, or like something pretending to be a woman, wearing what might have been a long dress, or maybe just shadows that clung to its form. But the face, Jesus, the face was all wrong. The proportions were off, the eyes too far apart, the mouth stretching wider than any human mouth should. And it was smiling at me, this horrible, knowing smile that said it could see me just as clearly as I could see it. I dropped my phone, the light spinning away and throwing crazy shadows everywhere. And when I scrambled to pick it up and looked again, the figure was gone. Just gone. No sound of it leaving, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. It had simply vanished like it was never there at all. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't even if I'd wanted to. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine running, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble, playing games on my phone to keep myself distracted and preserve some battery. Every few minutes I'd scan the darkness with my flashlight, seeing nothing but trees and rocks and the oppressive black of the Appalachian night. Around 3 a.m., I heard something else. Footsteps, real ones this time, crunching through the dried leaves near my van. Slow, deliberate steps, circling around me in a wide arc. I wanted to scream, wanted to start the van and just gun it down that mountain road in the dark, but I was terrified that movement would trigger something worse. So I sat there, breathing through my mouth to stay quiet, watching the shadows move in ways that didn't match any living thing I knew. The footsteps stopped right outside my driver's side door, so close I could hear breathing, ragged, wet breathing that sounded like it was coming from damaged lungs. Then a knock. 3 deliberate knocks on my window. I couldn't help it. I looked, but there was nothing there, just my own terrified reflection staring back at me. When dawn finally broke around 6:30, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, I'd never been so happy to see daylight in my entire life. The forest that had seemed so menacing in the dark looked almost normal now, just trees and rocks and morning mist rising from the valley below. I didn't waste any time. I yanked in my solar lights, didn't bother leveling the van or any of my usual departure routine, just fired up the engine and started heading back down that mountain road. My hands were still shaking on the steering wheel, my eyes felt like sandpaper from no sleep, and I kept checking my rearview mirror expecting to see something following me. The drive down seemed longer than the drive up, every turn and bump making me more anxious to reach civilization. When I finally hit the main road and saw the first signs of human activity, a mailbox, then a house, then another, I actually started crying from relief. But my nightmare wasn't over. As I passed through Millbrook, I saw Earl standing outside the gas station, and when our eyes met, he just slowly shook his head, like he'd known exactly what I'd encounter up there, like he'd seen it all before. I didn't stop in Millbrook, couldn't bring myself to face Earl and whatever "I told you so" conversation was waiting there. Instead, I kept driving, putting miles between me and Whisper Hollow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me down from that mountain. Every time I glanced in my rearview mirror, I half expected to see that tall figure standing in the road behind me, that horrible stretched smile on its face. My plan was to drive straight back to Charlotte, forget this ever happened, maybe see a therapist about what was clearly some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But my van had other ideas. About 15 miles past Millbrook, the engine started making this grinding noise I'd never heard before, and the temperature gauge shot into the red. I barely made it to a pull-off before the whole thing died, steam hissing from under the hood like some dying animal. Perfect. Just perfect, I muttered, slamming my hands against the steering wheel. I popped the hood and climbed out, immediately hit by the smell of burning coolant and hot metal. I'm not a mechanic, but I know enough to recognize a blown radiator hose when I see one. Fluid everywhere, the hose itself split wide open. This wasn't something I could fix on the side of the road, not without parts one didn't have. I pulled out my phone, relieved to see I had 2 bars of signal now that I was back in civilization, and started searching for the nearest mechanic. There was one in a town called Ashford, about 8 miles back the way I'd come. Back toward the mountains. Back toward Whisper Hollow. The irony wasn't lost on me, but what choice did I have? I called a tow truck, and the guy said he'd be there in 45 minutes. So I climbed back into my van, locked all the doors even though it was broad daylight, and waited. Those 45 minutes felt like 45 hours. I tried to distract myself with my phone, scrolling through social media, but every post felt disconnected from what I'd experienced, like they were transmissions from another reality where things like tall, wrong-faced women in the woods didn't exist. I called Darcy, desperately needing to hear a familiar voice. "Vera, how's the mountain adventure?" She answered, all cheerful and normal. I almost told her everything right then. The singing, the figure, the knocking, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you explain something like that without sounding completely insane? "It's fine," I lied. "Just having some van trouble. Might be delayed getting back." We chatted for a few minutes about nothing important, and I felt a little better, a little more grounded. After we hung up, I noticed something weird. There were scratches on my van's paint, right below the driver's side window where I'd heard that knocking. Long, deep scratches, 3 of them running parallel, like something with claws had dragged them down the metal. Those hadn't been there yesterday. I was sure of it. The tow truck finally arrived, driven by a guy named Marcus who looked about 30 and had the kind of easygoing attitude that made me want to trust him immediately. "Radiator hose, huh?" "Yeah, mountain roads can be rough on vehicles," he said as he hooked up my van. "You camping up near Whisper Hollow?" The question made my stomach drop. "How'd you know?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged. "Just a guess. That's where most out-of-towners go when they're van camping around here. Beautiful spot, but locals don't go up there much." I wanted to ask him why, wanted to know if he'd heard the stories Earl had hinted at, but he'd already moved on to discussing the repair timeline and costs. We rode in his truck to Ashford, my van trailing behind us on the flatbed, and he dropped me off at a small mechanic shop run by a woman named Jolene who looked like she could bench press my van if needed. Jolene gave me the bad news. She had to order the part, and it wouldn't arrive until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. "You're welcome to wait in town," she said. "There's a motel about 2 blocks that way. Nothing fancy, but it's clean." So that's how I found myself checking into the Ashford Inn, a rundown place with flickering neon sign and rooms that smelled like cigarettes and pine cleaner. The clerk, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, handed me a key to room 7 and barely looked up from his phone. I dragged my overnight bag inside, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed. It was only 2 p.m., but I was so exhausted from the sleepless night that I passed out almost immediately. When I woke up, it was dark outside, fully dark, and someone was singing outside my window. That same high, wavering voice from Whisper Hollow. My whole body went ice cold. It had followed me. Whatever that thing was, it had followed me down from the mountain, and now it knew exactly where I was. I lay perfectly still in that motel bed, every nerve ending screaming at me to move, to run, to do something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The singing outside my window was closer than it had been in the mountains, so close I could hear the wet quality of the voice, like there was fluid in the throat of whatever was making that sound. It wasn't just singing anymore either. There were words now, still in that language I didn't recognize, but I could hear the consonants and vowels forming, could hear the intention behind them. It sounded like a summons, like something calling me to come outside. My eyes fixed on the window, on the thin curtains that separated me from whatever was out there, and I watched as a shadow passed across them. Tall, impossibly tall, swaying in that same unnatural way I'd seen at Whisper Hollow. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, the singing stopped. I waited, counting my heartbeats, listening for any sound that would tell me it was gone. Nothing. Just the hum of the motel's ancient air conditioning unit and distant traffic from the main road. I finally worked up the courage to move, sliding out of bed as quietly as possible and grabbing the heavy lamp from the nightstand. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. I crept to the window, staying to the side, and carefully pulled back just the edge of the curtain to peek outside. The parking lot was empty except for 3 cars and my absence of a van, the yellow streetlights casting everything in a sickly glow. No tall figure, no woman in shadows, nothing out of the ordinary at all. But on the concrete right below my window, there were marks, scratch marks, the same pattern as on my van. 3 parallel lines, deep enough to gouge the concrete. I couldn't stay in that room. Didn't matter that it was almost 10 p.m., didn't matter that I was exhausted and shaking and probably losing my mind. I had to get out of there. I threw my stuff back in my bag, grabbed my keys and phone, and basically ran to the front office. The same kid was still at the desk, now watching something on a tablet. "I need to check out," I told him, my voice coming out higher and more panicked than I intended. He looked up at me like I'd grown a second head. "Now? You paid for the whole night." I didn't care about the money. I told him to keep it, just please process the checkout. But he insisted on following procedure, typing things into his computer with 2 fingers at a glacial pace. While I waited, I noticed a framed newspaper clipping on the wall behind him, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local woman vanishes near Whisper Hollow, 3rd disappearance this year." It was dated 1983. "Does that happen a lot?" I asked, pointing at the article. The kid glanced back at it and shrugged. "I guess. Before my time. My grandma talks about weird stuff happening in these mountains, but old people always have stories, you know?" He finally finished whatever he was doing and slid a receipt across the counter. "You okay though? You look pretty freaked out." I assured him I was fine, just needed to get on the road, and walked out into the parking lot. The night air was cold, that autumn chill that gets into your bones, and I could see my breath forming little clouds. I'd planned to sleep in my van while waiting for it to be fixed, but that obviously wasn't an option anymore. My only choice was to find somewhere public, somewhere with lights and people, and wait until morning. There was a 24-hour diner I'd passed on the way into town, so I started walking, keeping to the well-lit streets and checking over my shoulder every few steps. The diner was one of those classic chrome and red vinyl places, probably built in the 50s and never updated. Only 3 other people were inside, an elderly couple in a booth sharing pie, and a trucker at the counter nursing coffee. I slid into a booth near the back where I could see both the entrance and the windows, ordered coffee I didn't need, and tried to figure out what the hell was happening to me. The rational part of my brain kept insisting this was all exhaustion and stress, maybe some bad food, some kind of carbon monoxide leak in my van affecting my perception. But the scratches were real. The blown radiator hose right after leaving Whisper Hollow was real. And that singing, God, that singing was burned into my memory in a way that felt too vivid, too detailed to be a hallucination. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a name tag that said Beth, refilled my coffee without asking and noticed my hands shaking. "Rough night, honey?" she asked. I almost brushed her off, but something about her reminded me of my mom, and before I knew it I was telling her everything. About Whisper Hollow, about the figure, about the singing following me here. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she sat down across from me in the booth and said something that made my blood run cold. "You saw one of the changed ones." And now it's marked you. Beth's words hung in the air between us like smoke, and I wanted to laugh them off, to tell her she was as crazy as Earl back in Millbrook, but the look on her face stopped me. She wasn't joking. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was dead serious, and worse, she looked worried, genuinely worried for me. The changed ones. I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, glancing toward the kitchen to make sure no one was listening. My grandmother was Cherokee, grew up in these mountains before they pushed most of the people out. She told me stories about them. People who went into certain places, forbidden places, and came back different. Or things that looked like people but weren't, not anymore. The mountains changed them, twisted them into something else. And once they mark you, once they choose you, she trailed off, not finishing the sentence, which somehow made it worse than any ending she could have provided. What do I do? I asked, hating how desperate I sounded. Beth reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her skin warm and calloused. You don't go back up there, that's for damn sure. And you don't ignore it when it comes for you, because it will. They always come back for the ones they've marked. She told me about a ritual her grandmother used to do, something about burning sage and cedar, drawing symbols and salt around your sleeping space, speaking old words that were supposed to offer protection. It sounded insane, like something from a bad horror movie, but what other option did I have? Call the police and tell them a shape-shifting mountain spirit was stalking me? Yeah, that would go great. Beth wrote down the instructions on a napkin in surprisingly neat handwriting, told me where I could buy the supplies I'd need, and made me promise I'd be careful. These mountains are old, she said as she stood up to check on her other customers. Older than the Cherokee, older than any people. And some things that live in them don't think like we do, don't want what we want. To them, you're just interesting. I stayed in that diner until 6 a.m., drinking coffee and watching the darkness outside gradually give way to dawn. The elderly couple left around midnight, the trucker around 3, and for a couple hours it was just me and Beth and the cook in the back. Every time a car passed on the road outside, every time the wind rattled the windows, I jumped. Beth didn't say much else, but she kept my coffee topped off and occasionally patted my shoulder when she walked by, and somehow that small kindness kept me from completely falling apart. When the sun finally came up, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt like I could breathe again. Daylight meant safety. Daylight meant whatever was following me would have to hide, would have to wait. I paid my bill, leaving Beth a tip that was probably 3 times the cost of the coffee, and walked back toward the mechanic shop. Jolene was already there when I arrived, standing outside smoking a cigarette and looking at my van with a puzzled expression. "Morning," she called out when she saw me. "Got good news and weird news. Good news is the part came in early, and I can have you fixed up by noon. Weird news is I was just looking at your van, and I can't figure out how you did this much damage to it." She walked me around to the passenger side, and my stomach dropped. More scratches, dozens of them now, covering the entire side of the van in those same 3-line patterns. Some were shallow, some were deep enough to expose bare metal underneath the paint. "Looks like you dragged it through a thorn forest or something," Jolene said. "You hit a tree? Roll it." I stared at those scratches, knowing damn well they hadn't been there yesterday when the van got towed, and felt tears burning in my eyes. It had been here. While I was at the diner, while I was thinking daylight meant safety, it had been here marking my van, claiming it, claiming me. I helped Jolene replace the radiator hose, mostly just handing her tools and trying to keep my hands from shaking. She talked while she worked, casual conversation about the weather and local news, but I barely heard her. My mind was racing, trying to figure out my next move. I couldn't go home to Charlotte. What if I brought this thing with me, put Darcy or my neighbors in danger? But I couldn't stay here either, not in these mountains where it clearly had power, where it could find me anywhere. Around 11:30, Jolene finished up, wiped her hands on a rag, and told me I was good to go. I paid her in cash, got in my van, and sat there for a moment just staring at the steering wheel. The scratches on the outside might as well have been on my skin. I felt marked, branded, chosen for something I didn't understand and couldn't escape. I started the engine, and that's when I saw it in my rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the parking lot, partially hidden behind a tree. The tall figure. The changed one. And this time, in broad daylight where I could see it clearly, I realized with horror that I recognized the face. It was wearing my face, but wrong, stretched and distorted like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. It raised one hand and waved at me, a slow, deliberate gesture, and its mouth split open in that impossible smile. Then it stepped backward into the shadows and vanished. But I knew. God, I knew. This wasn't over. It would never be over. Whatever I'd awakened in Whisper Hollow had decided I belonged to it now, and these mountains never let go of what they claimed. My name is Roland Pritchard. I'm 52 years old, and I live in Nashville, Tennessee. I've been living out of my Sprinter van for about 8 months now, ever since my consulting business went under and I decided corporate life could go to hell. My daughter, Maisie, who's 28 and lives in Knoxville, thinks I'm having some kind of midlife crisis, but honestly, I've never felt more clear-headed. Sure, I'm sleeping in a glorified metal box and showering at truck stops, but at least I'm not pretending to care about quarterly projections anymore. My buddy from college, Pete, came with me on this particular trip. His wife kicked him out for a week after some argument about kitchen renovations, and he needed to blow off steam. Pete's never been the outdoorsy type, more of a craft beer and fantasy football guy, but he was desperate to get away, and I figured the company would be nice for a change. We'd been driving through the Appalachian Mountains for 2 days, hitting different trails and scenic overlooks, when Pete found this spot on some hiking forum. It was described as remote paradise, with incredible views and zero crowds, accessible only by a rough Forest Service road that most people's vehicles couldn't handle. The post mentioned it was near an abandoned coal mining town called Harwick, one of those places that died in the 70s when the industry collapsed. Pete was excited about it in that way people get when they think they've discovered something secret, something special. "Dude, look at these photos," he kept saying, shoving his phone in my face while I was trying to drive. "Nobody knows about this place. We'll have it all to ourselves." I wasn't as enthusiastic. Something about abandoned mining towns has always creeped me out, but Pete was insistent, and I figured what the hell, we'd camp there one night and move on. The drive to Harwick took us deep into the mountains on roads that got progressively worse, paved giving way to gravel, giving way to rutted dirt that made my van's suspension work overtime. We passed exactly 2 other vehicles in 40 minutes, both local trucks whose drivers stared at us with what I can only describe as curiosity mixed with pity. The forest pressed in close on both sides, old-growth trees that blocked out most of the afternoon sun and made everything feel darker than it should have been. We finally reached what remained of Harwick around 4 p.m. Maybe 15 structures still standing, most of them collapsed or collapsing, with rusted equipment scattered around like the skeleton of some massive industrial animal. "This is amazing," Pete said, already pulling out his phone to take pictures. "It's like a time capsule." To me, it looked depressing and vaguely threatening, but I kept that opinion to myself. We drove through the ghost town and found the camping spot about a mile beyond it, a clearing on a ridge that offered views of the valley below. I had to admit, Pete was right about one thing. The location was incredible. Mountains rolled away in every direction, covered in autumn colors that looked almost fake in their intensity, reds and oranges and yellows that practically glowed in the fading light. We set up camp quickly, Pete pitching his tent next to my van while I got my portable grill going for dinner. The plan was simple: cook some burgers, drink the 6-pack Pete had brought, maybe do some stargazing, then crash and head out in the morning. Just 2 middle-aged guys having a mild adventure before returning to their respective dysfunctions. We were laughing about something stupid, some inside joke from college, when we heard it for the first time. A scraping sound, metal on stone, coming from the direction of the abandoned town. Long, drawn-out scrapes, rhythmic, like someone dragging something heavy across rock. Pete stopped mid-sentence and looked at me. What the hell was that? We both stood there listening, the burgers forgotten on the grill, as the scraping continued for maybe 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. "Probably just something falling apart," I said, trying to sound confident. "Old buildings settling, metal sheeting in the wind, whatever." But there wasn't any wind, and we both knew it. Pete forced a laugh. "Yeah, you're right. This place is falling apart. Probably happens all the time." We went back to cooking, but the mood had shifted. That easy camaraderie from earlier was gone, replaced by a tension neither of us wanted to acknowledge. We ate our burgers mostly in silence. watching the sun sink below the mountains and the shadows lengthen across the valley. By the time we finished cleaning up, it was full dark, and the scraping sound started again. Closer this time. Much closer. And this time, it was accompanied by something else, a wet, labored breathing that didn't sound like it came from anything that should be alive. Pete's face went pale in the light from our campfire, and I could see his hands trembling as he set down his beer. "Roland, tell me you hear that too," he whispered, like speaking too loud might attract whatever was making those sounds. I nodded, unable to find my voice for a moment. The breathing was getting louder, closer, accompanied by that horrible scraping that now sounded less like metal on stone and more like claws on rock. It was circling us, moving through the trees at the edge of our clearing in a wide arc. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it toward the tree line, the beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing except tree trunks and underbrush. "Maybe it's a bear," Pete suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. "I've encountered bears before. This wasn't that. Bears don't breathe like they're drowning, and they don't move with that kind of deliberate, intelligent pattern." The sound stopped suddenly, leaving us in silence broken only by the crackling of our fire. We waited, both of us barely breathing, straining to hear anything that would tell us where it had gone. 5 minutes passed. 10. Pete finally let out a shaky laugh. "Jesus Christ, I thought I was going to have a heart attack. Whatever it was, I think it's gone." I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to panic him more than he already was. We decided to call it a night early, Pete retreating to his tent and me climbing into my van, both of us agreeing to keep our phones on and text if anything happened. I locked all the doors, which felt ridiculous but necessary, and tried to settle into bed. My van suddenly felt very small, very exposed, sitting on this ridge in the middle of nowhere with something unknown prowling around outside. I must have dozed off around midnight because I woke up to my phone buzzing with a text from Pete. "Something's outside my tent." The timestamp said 2:17 a.m. I texted back immediately, "What do you hear?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, scratching on the tent fabric, moving around the outside. Slow circles. My heart was hammering now. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully looked out my windows, trying to see Pete's tent. It was maybe 20 feet from my van, a dark shape in the moonlight, and I could just make out movement around it. Something low to the ground, circling it exactly like Pete described. I couldn't see what it was clearly, just a shadow among shadows, but it was definitely there. My phone buzzed again. It's at the door now. I can see the fabric moving. "Roland, what do I do?" I made a decision that probably saved Pete's life. "Stay completely still and quiet," I texted. "Don't move, don't make a sound. I'm going to try something." I started my van's engine and laid on the horn, a blast of sound that shattered the night silence. The effect was immediate. Whatever was outside Pete's tent bolted, and I caught a glimpse of it in my headlights as it ran back toward the tree line. It moved wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Like a person running on all fours, but the proportions were off, the limbs too long, the movement too fluid. It disappeared into the darkness before I could get a good look, but the image was burned into my brain. Pete burst out of his tent and ran to my van, yanking open the passenger door and diving inside. "Lock it! Lock it!" he shouted, and I hit the button, all the doors clicking shut with a sound that felt far too flimsy. We sat there in the van with the engine running and the lights on, both of us breathing hard and trying to process what just happened. Pete's tent was still standing, but I could see long tears in the fabric from here, parallel slashes like something with claws had tested its strength. "We need to leave," Pete said, his voice shaking. "Right now? We need to get the fuck out of here." I wanted to agree, wanted nothing more than to gun it down that mountain road and not stop until we hit civilization, but I'd seen enough horror movies to know how that ended. "It's a 7-mile drive on a narrow dirt road with steep drops on both sides," I told him. "In the dark, with something possibly following us. We'd be sitting ducks, or we'd drive off a cliff." Pete looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "So what? We just wait here until morning." I nodded slowly. "We wait here, in the van, with the doors locked and the engine running. Whatever that thing is, it can't get through metal and glass. Probably." The probably hung between us like a death sentence, but Pete eventually nodded. We were stuck here until dawn, trapped on this ridge with something that had already shown it wanted to get at us. All we could do was wait and pray that sunrise came before our gas tank ran empty. We sat in that van for what felt like an eternity, the dashboard clock ticking away with agonizing slowness. Pete kept checking his phone, even though we both knew there was no signal up here, just a nervous habit that gave him something to do with his hands. Around 3 a.m., the scratching started on my van, soft at first, almost gentle, like someone testing the paint with their fingernails. Then harder, more insistent, the sound of something sharp dragging across metal in long, deliberate strokes. It was coming from the back of the van, near the rear doors, and I could feel each scratch vibrating through the frame. Pete grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "It's trying to get in," he whispered. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was just testing us, but honestly I thought he might be right. Whatever was out there had intelligence behind it, purpose, and it was methodical in the way it moved around my van, searching for a weakness. The scratching moved to the driver's side, then the passenger side where Pete sat frozen, his eyes wide and locked on the window next to him. We could hear it breathing again, that wet, labored sound, right on the other side of the glass. Pete's window started to fog up from the inside, our breath condensing in the cold night air, and then something pressed against it from outside. Not a hand. The shape was wrong. Too many protrusions, too many joints, but it left a smear on the glass that looked disturbingly like blood mixed with something darker. "Don't look at it," I told Pete, my voice barely audible. "Just keep your eyes forward." But I couldn't follow my own advice. I turned my head just enough to see the reflection in my driver's side mirror, and what I saw made my stomach turn. It was crouched next to Pete's window, a twisted thing that might have been human once, but wasn't anymore. The moonlight caught parts of it, elongated fingers ending in blackened nails, skin that looked like it had been stretched over a frame too large for it, and a face that was just wrong in every possible way. It stayed there for maybe 2 minutes, pressed against Pete's window, breathing that horrible wet breath and leaving more smears on the glass. Then it moved again, climbing onto the hood of my van with a thump that made both of us jump. We could see its shadow through the windshield, a hunched shape that seemed too big to fit in the space it occupied. It was looking at us. I could feel its gaze even though I couldn't see its eyes clearly, could feel it studying us like we were insects in a jar. Pete was hyperventilating now, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and I was worried he might pass out. "Breathe slower," I told him. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Come on, Pete, stay with me." He tried. I'll give him credit for that. But his whole body was shaking and tears were streaming down his face. This wasn't the beer-loving fantasy football guy I'd known for 30 years. This was a man confronting something his brain couldn't process, something that violated every rule of reality he'd built his life on. The thing on my hood suddenly threw its head back. I could see the movement through the windshield, and let out a sound that I can only describe as a shriek mixed with a moan, something that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. It was so loud that Pete screamed and covered his ears, and I felt like my skull was going to split open from the pressure of it. The sound went on for at least 10 seconds, echoing off the mountains around us, and then it stopped abruptly. The thing climbed off my hood and disappeared into the darkness, its footsteps, or whatever it used to move, fading back toward the abandoned town. We sat in stunned silence, both of us shaking, neither of us quite believing what had just happened. "It's gone," Pete finally said, his voice hoarse. "Is it gone?" I checked all the mirrors, scanned the clearing as best I could in the darkness. Nothing. No movement, no sounds, just the idling of my engine and our ragged breathing. But I didn't trust it. Something about the way it had left felt wrong, too easy, like it was playing with us. "We're not getting out of this van until there's sunlight," I said firmly. "I don't care if it seems gone. We stay locked in here." Pete didn't argue. We spent the next 3 hours in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every sound, real or imagined. My gas gauge was getting lower. I'd burned through almost a quarter tank just keeping the engine running, and I started doing math in my head, calculating if we had enough fuel to make it down the mountain once dawn came. It would be close, really close. Around 5:30, the sky started to lighten, that pre-dawn gray that meant sunrise wasn't far off. Pete had his hand on the door handle, ready to bolt the second there was enough light. "We need to leave the tent," he said. "All my gear, my wallet, everything's in there." I shook my head. "We leave it. We get in this van and we drive. and we don't stop until we're back on a paved road with other people around." He started to protest, but then we both saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, right where the trees began, was the thing. And in the growing light, we could finally see it clearly. It had been a person once. You could tell from the basic shape, the way it stood upright, but something had changed it, twisted it into something else. Its skin was mottled and gray, stretched tight over bones that jutted at wrong angles. Its fingers were twice as long as they should be, ending in those blackened claws we'd heard all night. And its face, God, its face was the worst part. The features were still recognizably human, but distorted, like someone had grabbed them and pulled them in different directions. It was smiling at us, a wide, impossible smile that showed too many teeth. And then it raised one of those elongated hands and beckoned to us, a come here gesture that was somehow more terrifying than anything else it had done. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I threw the van into gear and gunned it, tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. Pete was yelling something, but I couldn't hear him over the roar of the engine and the blood pounding in my ears. In my rearview mirror, I saw the thing lurch forward, moving with that horrible fluid motion, chasing after us as we barreled toward the road that led back down the mountain. It was fast. Jesus Christ, it was so much faster than anything that size should be. And for a terrifying moment, I thought it might actually catch us. But my van hit the road and I pushed the accelerator to the floor, and slowly, gradually, the distance between us grew. I watched in the mirror as it finally stopped at the edge of the clearing, standing there in the dawn light, still making that beckoning gesture. Then it turned and walked back toward the abandoned town, disappearing among the ruined buildings like it had never existed at all. The drive down that mountain road was a blur of adrenaline and terror. I took corners too fast, barely staying on the narrow track, rocks pinging off the undercarriage and tree branches scraping the sides. Pete was gripping the oh shit handle above his door, his knuckles white, but he didn't tell me to slow down. We both understood that distance was the only thing that mattered now, putting as many miles as possible between us and whatever that thing was. When we finally hit pavement about 20 minutes later, I actually started crying from relief. Real roads meant civilization, meant safety, meant we'd survived something that by all rights should have killed us. Pete was crying too, these quiet, shaking sobs that he tried to hide by looking out his window. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? We drove for about an hour before pulling into a gas station in a town called Millerton. I needed to fill up. The tank was nearly empty from running the engine all night, and both of us needed to use the bathroom and maybe splash some water on our faces, try to look like we hadn't just escaped from a nightmare. While the van was filling, Pete finally broke the silence. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said quietly. "They'll think we're insane." "Hell, I think I'm insane and I was there." I nodded slowly. He was right. How do you explain something like that to people who've never seen it? How do you describe a thing that shouldn't exist attacking you in the middle of the night? We'd sound like we'd lost our minds, or we're on drugs, or making up stories for attention. "What do we tell people about your tent and gear?" I asked. Pete shrugged. "Lost it. Stolen. I don't care. I'm never going back there to get it." Inside the gas station, I bought coffee and some snacks we didn't really want, but needed to seem normal. The clerk was a young woman, maybe early 20s, and she gave us a concerned look. "You guys okay? You look like you've been through hell." I forced a smile. "Long night of camping. Didn't sleep well." She nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, camping around here can be rough. Lots of wildlife." If she only knew. As I was paying, an older man who'd been browsing the magazine rack came up to the counter. He'd clearly heard our conversation. "Where were you camping?" he asked. When I told him we'd been near Harwick, his expression changed. "Near the old coal town? You boys are lucky to be standing here." He went on to explain that locals avoided that area, had for decades. There'd been accidents at the mine back in the 50s, cave-ins that trapped miners underground. Some bodies were never recovered. "People say things still live in those tunnels," he said. "Things that used to be men but aren't anymore. Changed by being trapped in the dark, breathing bad air, eating God knows what to survive. They come out at night sometimes, looking for." He trailed off, seeming to realize how crazy he sounded. The clerk rolled her eyes. "Don't scare the tourists with your ghost stories, Mr. Hendricks." But Mr. Hendricks wasn't smiling. "Ain't ghost stories when people go missing. 3 hikers in the last 5 years, all of them camping near Harwick. They find the camps torn up, find blood sometimes, but never find the people. He looked directly at me. Whatever you saw up there, whatever happened, be grateful you got out. Most don't. Pete and I left quickly after that, getting back in the van and just driving. We didn't have a destination in mind, just needed to move, to keep putting distance between us and those mountains. Around noon, we stopped at a diner for food neither of us could really eat. Pete kept looking at his hands, which were still trembling slightly. I keep thinking about that thing's face, he said quietly. How it looked almost human. What if it was human once? What if those miners really are still alive down there, changed into that? I didn't have an answer for him. The thought had been haunting me too, that the thing we'd encountered might have been a person once, someone who went into those mines and never came back out, transformed by isolation and darkness and desperation into something monstrous. It was almost worse than thinking it was just some unknown creature. At least monsters were supposed to exist outside of humanity. But this was what humans could become under the right circumstances, or the wrong ones. We finished our meal in silence and got back on the road. Pete wanted to go straight home to Knoxville, deal with his wife and the kitchen renovation argument that seemed trivial now. I was heading back to Nashville, back to my van life that suddenly felt a lot less appealing. As we drove, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were scratches on my dashboard, 3 parallel lines carved into the plastic. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it, which meant that thing had been inside my van at some point during the night, had been inches away from us while we thought we were safe behind locked doors. I didn't tell Pete. He was barely holding it together as it was. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that we hadn't escaped unscathed. That thing had marked us, claimed us in some way, and I had a horrible feeling that distance wouldn't matter. That one day, maybe weeks or months or years from now, it would find us again. Because whatever lived in those mountains near Harwick didn't let go of what it claimed. And we'd stumbled into its territory, survived its test, and now we belonged to it in ways I couldn't fully understand but felt in every cell of my body. We drove in silence for another hour before Pete finally noticed the scratches on my dashboard. I saw his eyes lock onto them, watched the color drain from his face as he realized what they meant. "Roland," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "When did those get there?" I kept my eyes on the road, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. "I don't know. Sometime during the night, I guess." Pete twisted in his seat to look at the back of the van, and I knew what he was thinking. If it had gotten inside once, it could do it again. "Check everything," I told him. "Look for any other signs it was in here." He spent the next 10 minutes going through the van, opening cabinets, checking under the bed platform, examining every surface. When he came back to the passenger seat, his face was pale and sweaty. "There's more," he said, pulling out his phone and showing me a photo. He'd found scratches inside one of my storage compartments, the same 3-line pattern, carved deep into the wooden panel. And worse, there was something else, a smell he'd noticed coming from under my bed, something rotten and organic that hadn't been there before. "I didn't look," he said. "I couldn't. But something's under there, Roland. Something it left." My stomach turned. The idea that this thing had been inside my van, my home, leaving pieces of itself or its kills hidden away like some kind of twisted gift, it was violating in a way I couldn't fully process. But I couldn't deal with it now, not while driving, not with Pete already on the edge of a breakdown. "We'll handle it when we stop," I told him, though I had no idea how we were actually going to handle any of this. We made it to Knoxville around 3 p.m., and I dropped Pete off at his house. His wife, Karen, came out when she saw us pull up, her expression going from annoyed to concerned the moment she saw Pete's face. "What happened?" she asked, looking between us. "Pete, you look terrible." He tried to smile, tried to play it off as just a rough camping trip, but he couldn't quite manage it. He grabbed his bag from the back. We'd stopped at a Walmart earlier so he could buy some basic clothes to replace what he'd left in the tent, and gave me a look that said everything words couldn't. We'd been through something together that had changed us, marked us in ways that went beyond those scratches. "Take care of yourself," he said, and it sounded like a goodbye, like he knew we probably wouldn't see each other again. Some experiences bond people together. Others are so horrifying they make you want to avoid anyone who shares the memory, because looking at them means remembering what you'd both rather forget. I drove back to Nashville alone, and with every mile, The dread grew heavier in my chest. I couldn't go back to Vanlife. Not now, not knowing that thing had been inside my home. But I also couldn't afford an apartment, couldn't just abandon this lifestyle I'd built. When I finally pulled into a rest stop outside Nashville around 7 p.m., I forced myself to check under the bed platform. The smell hit me immediately when I lifted it. Rot and copper and something else, something chemical that burned my nostrils. There, tucked into the corner, was a cloth bundle tied with what looked like dried grass. My hands shook as I pulled it out, and every instinct screamed at me not to open it, to just throw it away and pretend I'd never found it. But I had to know. I had to see what it had left me. Inside the bundle was a collection of items that made my blood run cold. Human teeth, at least a dozen of them, stained yellow and brown. A tarnished wedding ring. A driver's license so faded I could barely read it, but I could make out enough. A name, a date from 1957, and a photo of a young man who might have been a minor. And underneath everything, a piece of paper, brittle with age, with words written in something dark that might have been dried blood. You are marked. You will return. They always return. I dropped the bundle like it had burned me, stumbling backward out of my van and gasping for air. This wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, whatever those changed ones were, they hadn't let us go. They were waiting, patient as the mountains themselves, knowing that eventually curiosity or compulsion or fate would draw us back to Harwick. That we'd return to those abandoned mines, those dark tunnels where men had become monsters, and when we did, we'd join them. I stood there in that rest stop parking lot as the sun set and darkness crept across the sky, and I realized with absolute certainty that my life, as I knew it, was over. I was marked. Pete was marked. And sooner or later, willingly or not, we'd find ourselves driving back up that mountain road, back to the thing that had claimed us, back to a transformation I couldn't imagine but could feel waiting for me like a promise. The mountains had chosen us, and the mountains never let go. Some part of me, the part that still remembered being human, being Roland Pritchard from Nashville, wanted to fight it, wanted to burn that bundle and drive as far away as possible. But another part, a part that was growing stronger with each passing hour, whispered that maybe going back wouldn't be so bad. Maybe becoming something else, something changed, was better than living with this fear and this knowledge for the rest of my natural life. I got back in my van, locked the doors even though I knew they meant nothing, and drove into Nashville as night fell around me. But I knew it was temporary. This city, this life, this humanity, it was all borrowed time now. The mountains were calling, and eventually I would answer. I thought spending a night in my van near an old Appalachian trail would be peaceful, maybe even spiritual. Instead, I found myself caught in something ancient and hungry, something the Cherokee warned about centuries ago, but nobody believed anymore. What I experienced in those mountains wasn't just scary. It was a reminder that some places were never meant for human feet, and some hungers can never be satisfied. My name is Deirdre Callahan. I'm 38 years old, and I live in Richmond, Virginia. I've been living the van life for just under a year now, ever since my divorce finalized and I realized I had nothing tying me to any one place anymore. No kids, no pets, no job that couldn't be done remotely. I'm a freelance graphic designer, so as long as I have Wi-Fi in my laptop, I can work from anywhere. My brother, Tommy, thinks I'm running away from my problems, but he doesn't get it. I'm not running from anything. I'm running towards something, toward freedom and possibility and a life that's actually mine. The Appalachian Mountains had been calling to me for months. Everyone in the van community talking about how beautiful they were in autumn, how spiritual the experience could be if you found the right spot. I'd connected with this woman online, Shauna, who'd been van living for 5 years and knew the Appalachians like the back of her hand. She wasn't coming on this trip. She was dealing with some family stuff back in Oregon, but she'd sent me detailed directions to what she called her secret spot, a place off the beaten path where you could park overnight without getting hassled by rangers or locals. It's near an old trail the Cherokee used to use, she'd written in her message. Really powerful energy there. You'll love it. She'd also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that locals had some superstitions about the area, something about not staying past midnight during certain phases of the moon. I'd laughed it off as quirky mountain folklore, the kind of thing people tell to make their region seem more mysterious and interesting. The drive into the mountains was gorgeous, everything Shauna had promised and more. The leaves were at peak color, creating this tunnel of gold and crimson that the afternoon sun filtered through in shafts of amber light. I passed through a tiny town called Greer's Gap, stopping at a general store to grab some supplies and maybe get some local intel about the area. The woman behind the counter, probably in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, was friendly enough until I mentioned where I was planning to camp. Her smile disappeared immediately. "Raven's Crossing?" she said, her voice dropping. "That's what the old trail's called. You don't want to camp there, honey. Especially not tonight." When I asked why, she got vague, talking about bad history and things that don't rest easy. I thanked her for her concern, but explained I'd be fine, that I had bear spray and a charged phone and plenty of camping experience. She rang up my purchases, some canned soup, crackers, a bottle of wine I probably didn't need, but before I left, she grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone her age. "Listen to me. If you insist on going up there, you follow these rules. Don't leave your vehicle after dark. Don't respond if you hear your name called. And whatever you do, don't look directly at anything that doesn't cast a shadow." I must have looked at her like she was crazy because she let go and stepped back, shaking her head. "Your funeral," she muttered. "Just don't say nobody warned you." I left the store feeling uneasy but also kind of annoyed. Why did locals always have to be so dramatic about everything? It was just a camping spot, just one night in the woods. Nothing was going to happen. The trail to Raven's Crossing was exactly where Shauna said it would be, marked by a faded wooden sign that was so weathered I could barely read it. The road, if you could call it that, was rough enough that I had to engage four-wheel drive, my van bouncing over rocks and roots as I climbed higher into the mountains. It took about 30 minutes to reach the clearing Shauna had described, a flat area surrounded by ancient oaks and overlooking a ravine that dropped away into shadow. The view was breathtaking, the kind of scene that makes you understand why people write poems about nature. I parked facing the ravine, set up my camp chair outside, and cracked open that bottle of wine. This was perfect. This was exactly what I needed. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, I felt more at peace than I had in months. All those warnings from the woman at the store seemed ridiculous now. There was nothing scary about this place. It was beautiful. It was sacred, and I had it all to myself. That's when I noticed the cairns, those stacks of rocks people sometimes make as trail markers or art pieces. There were dozens of them, arranged in a wide circle around the clearing, each one precisely balanced and way too deliberate to be natural. And carved into the largest oak tree, barely visible in the fading light, were symbols I didn't recognize. Not graffiti, not modern. These looked old, worn smooth by decades or maybe centuries of weather. I walked over to examine them, running my fingers over the grooves, and felt a chill run down my spine despite the mild temperature. Something about those symbols felt wrong, felt like a warning I couldn't read. But the sun was setting fast, and I needed to get my dinner started, so I pushed the unease aside and went back to my van. Just old carvings, I told myself. Probably from the Cherokee people who used to use this trail. Nothing to worry about. But as darkness fell and the temperature dropped, I couldn't shake the feeling that those symbols were trying to tell me something important. Something I should have listened to. I made myself a simple dinner of heated soup and crackers, eating in my van with the side door open so I could still enjoy the view. The night air was crisp and clean, carrying that distinctive mountain smell of pine and earth and decaying leaves. By 8 p.m., it was fully dark, the kind of absolute darkness you never get in cities where light pollution bleeds into everything. Out here, the stars were incredible, thousands of them scattered across the sky like someone had thrown diamonds against black velvet. I sat in my doorway with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, sipping wine and feeling grateful for this life I'd built for myself. Sure, I was alone, but alone felt different than lonely. Alone felt like freedom. Around 9 p.m., I heard the first sound that didn't belong. It started as a low humming, almost musical, coming from somewhere down in the ravine. At first I thought it might be wind moving through a cave or crevice in a way that created that tone, but it was too steady, too deliberate. It rose and fell in a pattern that felt intentional, like a song without words. I stood up and walked to the edge of the clearing where the ground dropped away into darkness, trying to locate the source. The humming continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I realized something disturbing. There were no normal night sounds. No crickets, no owls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The forest had gone completely silent except for that humming, and now even that was gone. I went back to my van, suddenly not feeling quite as brave about being out here alone. The woman at the store had said not to leave my vehicle after dark, and while I'd rolled my eyes at the time, now that advice seemed a lot more reasonable. I climbed inside, closed and locked the side door, and settled into my bed with my laptop to do some work and distract myself. But I couldn't focus. Every few minutes I'd glance out the windows, scanning the darkness for movement. The cairns were still visible in my peripheral vision, pale stacks of stone that seemed almost luminescent in the starlight. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that the old woman had gotten into my head with her superstitious warnings, but something felt genuinely wrong about this place. At 10:30, I heard my name. Deirdre. Clear as day, a woman's voice calling from somewhere outside the van. My heart jumped into my throat. Nobody knew I was here. Shauna knew the general area, but not the exact timing, and I hadn't told anyone else about this trip. Deirdre, I need help. The voice was closer now, coming from the direction of the ravine. It sounded distressed, frightened, and every instinct in my body wanted to help. I moved toward the side door, my hand on the lock, before I remembered what the store clerk had said. Don't respond if you hear your name called. I froze, hand trembling on the door handle as the voice called again. Deirdre, please. I'm hurt. I fell and I can't get back up. It sounded so real, so genuine, so human, but something about it was off. The voice didn't quite echo right, didn't interact with the environment the way a real voice should. And there was a flatness to it, like someone reading lines without understanding the emotion behind them. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone, turning on the camera and holding it up to the window to record whatever was out there. Through the screen, I could see the clearing, the cairns, the dark line of trees, and standing right at the edge of the ravine, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. It looked like a woman, tall and thin, wearing what might have been a long dress or cloak. She was facing my van, and even though I couldn't see her face clearly, I knew she was looking directly at me. Deirdre, she called again, and this time I could see her mouth moving, see the shape of my name forming on her lips. Come help me, please. The video was recording, capturing all of this, and I thought maybe if something terrible happened, at least there would be evidence. At least someone would know what I'd encountered out here. The figure took a step toward my van, then another, moving with a strange gliding motion that didn't look quite like walking. That's when I noticed what the store clerk had warned me about. In the starlight, surrounded by trees and rocks that all cast faint shadows, this figure cast none at all. Where it stood, there should have been a shadow stretching across the ground. But there was nothing, just the figure itself, existing in defiance of the basic laws of physics and light. I dropped my phone onto the bed and scrambled backward, pressing myself against the far wall of the van like that extra 3 feet of distance would somehow protect me. The figure continued moving toward my van, that unnatural gliding motion getting faster, more purposeful. My brain was screaming contradictory instructions: drive away, hide, call for help, do something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, watching through the window as this shadowless thing approached. When it reached the side of my van, it stopped, just stood there, maybe 2 feet from my door, close enough that if the door were open I could have reached out and touched it. Through the window, I could see more details now, details I desperately didn't want to see. The dress or cloak it wore wasn't fabric. It was something else, something that moved wrong, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And the face, God, the face was the worst part. It looked human at first glance, but the proportions were all wrong. The eyes were too large and set too far apart, the mouth too wide, the nose just a suggestion rather than an actual feature. And it was smiling, this terrible empty smile that didn't reach those oversized eyes. Deirdre, it said again, and now that it was so close I could hear the wrongness in the voice more clearly. It wasn't coming from the mouth. The lips were moving, but the sound was coming from somewhere else, somewhere around or behind or inside the figure itself. Let me in. I'm so cold out here. Let me in and I'll tell you secrets. I'll tell you about the others who came before you. My hand involuntarily moved toward the door lock before I caught myself. There was something in that voice, something compelling, something that made you want to obey even as every rational part of your brain screamed danger. I forced myself to look away from the figure, to break whatever hold it was trying to establish. I grabbed my phone and texted Tommy, even though I knew he wouldn't see it until morning. No signal out here, but at least the message would queue up and send when I got back to civilization. If I got back, something's wrong. At Raven's Crossing in the Appalachians. If you don't hear from me by tomorrow, call the police. Typing it out made it real, made this whole situation undeniably real in a way that terrified me. This wasn't just my imagination or too much wine or stress from the divorce. There was something outside my van, something that knew my name, something that didn't follow the rules of reality I'd spent 38 years understanding. The figure, the thing, suddenly moved again, circling my van slowly. I could track its progress by the sound of its movement. Not footsteps exactly, but a sort of sliding, scraping noise like dry leaves being dragged across gravel. It went around the back, then up the driver's side, then across the front. Testing, searching for a way in. When it reached the passenger side, it stopped at the window near where I sat. We were separated by maybe 6 inches and a pane of glass. I could see my own terrified reflection superimposed over its face in the window. Could see how pale I'd gone, how wide my eyes were. The thing raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. The hand was wrong too. Too many joints in the fingers, the nails more like claws, the skin an unhealthy gray-white color that looked like it had never seen sun. It tapped once, twice, 3 times. Then it spoke again, and this time the voice was different, deeper, older. This is our place. You're in our place. You have to pay the toll. I found my voice finally, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What toll? What do you want? The thing's smile widened impossibly, the mouth stretching until it seemed to reach from ear to ear. A trade. Something of yours for something of ours. A piece of you left here, a piece of us taken with you. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. Its fingers drummed against the glass in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. The Cherokee knew. They paid the toll when they walked this trail. They left offerings at the cairns, bits of food and hair and sometimes blood. But you didn't leave anything, Deirdre. You just took. You took our view, our air, our space. Now you have to pay. The reasonable part of my brain that still functioned knew I shouldn't negotiate with this thing, shouldn't engage at all. But the survival part, the part that wanted desperately to see morning, made me ask, what kind of trade? The thing considered this, its head tilting at an angle that necks aren't meant to bend. A memory. Give us a memory you treasure, and we'll let you leave. We'll take it from you, and you'll never recall it again, but you'll be free to go. It sounded almost reasonable when it said it, almost fair. Just one memory in exchange for my life. But something about that offer felt like a trap, felt like there was more to it than the thing was saying. I thought about all the warnings the store clerk had given me, about how she'd said things here didn't rest easy, about bad history. What happened to the others? I asked. The other people who came here and didn't pay your toll? The thing's smile faded slightly. They're still here, down in the ravine, down where the old trail leads. Some of them paid, but not enough. Some of them refused. Either way, they stayed. They became part of this place, part of us. Would you like to meet them? The casual way it offered to introduce me to the dead people in the ravine made my stomach turn. I pressed myself harder against the back wall of my van, as if I could somehow phase through the metal and escape. I don't want to meet anyone, I managed to say. I just want to leave. I'll go right now. I won't come back. The thing made a sound that might have been laughter, a dry rattling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Too late for that. You're here now. You've breathed our air, walked our ground, disturbed our stones. The only question is what you'll pay and what you'll become. Its fingers stopped drumming and instead began to scratch at the glass, not hard enough to break it, but enough to leave marks, to show me how fragile that barrier really was. I looked at my phone, desperately hoping for even one bar of signal, but there was nothing. The time read 11:47 p.m. The store clerk had mentioned something about midnight, about certain phases of the moon. I didn't know what phase it was now, hadn't thought to check, but I had a sinking feeling that midnight was significant, that whatever was happening would get worse when the clock struck 12. What happens at midnight? I asked, my voice shaking. The thing's head straightened, those two large eyes seeming to focus on me with greater intensity. The veil thins. The others can come through. Right now it's just me, just the scout, the one who asks nicely. But at midnight, they all come. The ones who died on this trail, the ones who were sacrificed here, the ones who couldn't pay and never left. They're hungry, Deirdre. So hungry. And they're not as patient as I am. I had maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes to figure out how to survive this. How to either pay whatever toll would satisfy this thing or escape before midnight brought something worse. My keys were in the ignition. I'd left them there out of habit, just in case I needed to move quickly. But the thing was right outside, close enough to block my way if I tried to get to the driver's seat. Still, what choice did I have? Stay here and wait for midnight, or try to make a run for it? I decided to buy time, to negotiate, even though everything in me screamed that you couldn't trust a thing like this. What kind of memory would you want? I asked. How do I choose? The thing seemed pleased by the question, its horrible smile returning. A happy one. The happier the better. First love, childhood joy, a moment of pure contentment. Those are the sweetest, the ones we crave most. I thought about my memories, trying to sort through them quickly. My wedding day, despite how things ended. Christmas mornings as a kid. The day I got accepted to art school. The summer I spent in Ireland with my college roommate. Each one felt precious, irreplaceable, part of what made me who I was. The idea of giving one up, of having it carved out of my brain and consumed by this creature, was horrifying. But maybe more horrifying was ending up like the others, down in that ravine, becoming part of this place forever. If I give you a memory, you'll let me leave? You swear it. The thing nodded slowly. I swear it on the old earth, on the stones that were here before humans walked, on the darkness that waits beneath. Give us a memory and you can go. You'll drive away and never return, and we'll feast on what you've given us. My phone showed 11:52, 8 minutes until midnight. I made a decision that I knew I'd probably regret, but couldn't see any alternative to. Okay, I said. I'll trade. I'll give you a memory, but you have to tell me how. How does this work? The thing pressed both hands against the glass now, and I could see its breath, if it even breathed, fogging the window. You open your mind to me. You think about the memory, recall it in detail, and I reach in and take it. It doesn't hurt. You won't even know it's gone until you try to remember it later and find only emptiness. The thought of letting this thing into my head was nauseating, but I didn't see another option. I closed my eyes and thought about the memory I'd chosen. The summer in Ireland, 3 months of perfect freedom with my best friend Sarah, before adult responsibilities and marriages and everything else complicated life. I could see it so clearly. Green hills, stone walls, pub music, Sarah's laugh, the taste of Guinness and the smell of peat smoke. I felt it then, a cold presence pushing into my thoughts, like fingers made of ice water sliding through my skull. It didn't hurt exactly, but it was invasive, violating, wrong in every possible way. The memory started to fade, details bleaching out like an old photograph left in the sun. Sarah's face became less distinct, the green hills turned gray, the music distorted into noise. I tried to hold on to it, but it slipped away like water through my fingers, and within seconds it was gone. Just gone. I knew I'd had a memory of Ireland, but I couldn't recall any details, couldn't picture what I'd done there or who I'd been with. It was a hole in my past, a blank space where something important used to be. I opened my eyes, tears streaming down my face. There. I paid. Now let me go. The thing stepped back from the van, and for a moment I thought it would keep its word. Then I checked my phone. 11:59, 1 minute until midnight. You should leave now, the thing said, its voice almost gentle. Drive fast and don't look back, because they're coming, and they won't be as merciful as I was. I didn't need to be told twice. I launched myself from the back of the van toward the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the ignition. The engine roared to life just as my phone's clock flipped to 12 o'clock, and that's when I heard them. Voices, dozens of them, rising from the ravine in a cacophony of moans and whispers and screams. The shadowless thing that had been at my window stepped aside, almost politely, and gestured toward the road leading back down the mountain. I didn't wait to see what was coming up from that ravine. I threw the van into gear and gunned it, tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. In my rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of shapes emerging from the darkness. human-shaped but wrong, moving in ways that defied physics, their mouths open in eternal screams or hunger or both. The road down was a nightmare of sharp turns and steep drops, and I was taking it way too fast, my headlights barely able to keep up with my speed. Branches scraped against the sides of my van, rocks pinged off the undercarriage, and twice I nearly lost control on loose gravel. But behind me, those shapes were following, keeping pace despite the fact that I was doing 40 miles an hour on a road meant for maybe 15. They didn't run, they flowed, like water pouring downhill, a wave of wrongness that threatened to overtake me. I pushed the accelerator harder, my van protesting with every gear shift, the engine whining in distress. A horrible scraping sound started from the roof, like something had landed there and was trying to tear through the metal. I swerved violently, sideswiping a tree trunk, and whatever was on top tumbled off with a shriek that made my eardrums ache. The shapes were gaining on me. I could see them more clearly now in my mirrors. Dozens of figures, some recognizable as having once been human, others twisted into forms that bore only passing resemblance to people. Their faces were the worst part, frozen in expressions of terror or rage or a horrible, empty hunger that transcended death. These were the ones who'd come to Raven's Crossing before me, the ones who'd camped here and either refused to pay the toll or hadn't paid enough. The ones who'd become part of this place, part of whatever ancient thing claimed this mountain. And now they wanted company. They wanted me to join them, to stay here forever in the darkness between the living world and wherever they'd gone. My phone started buzzing. Somehow I had signal again, must have gotten far enough down the mountain, and I saw Tommy's name on the screen. I couldn't answer, couldn't take my hands off the wheel for even a second, but knowing someone in the normal world was trying to reach me made me feel slightly less alone. I hit the main trail entrance doing 50, my van airborne for a second as I launched off a bump, landing hard enough that my teeth clacked together and I bit my tongue. The taste of blood filled my mouth, but I didn't slow down. The paved road was ahead, just another quarter mile, and once I reached it, I'd be safe. I had to believe that. Had to believe these things were bound to their mountain, to their trail, to the place where they'd died. But as I approached the boundary between the dirt trail and the pavement, the shapes behind me surged forward in one last desperate attempt. I felt something grab the back bumper, felt my van lurch as weight attached itself to the rear. For a terrifying moment, I thought they'd drag me backward, pull me back into their realm, but my momentum was too strong. I hit the pavement with a screech of tires and kept going, and whatever had grabbed me let go with a sound like tearing fabric. I drove for another 10 miles before I felt safe enough to pull over at a gas station, my whole body shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. It was 12:47 a.m., less than an hour since I'd been trapped at Raven's Crossing, though it felt like days. I checked my van in the harsh fluorescent lights of the gas station. There were scratches all over it, deep gouges in the paint and metal, and my back bumper was partially torn off, hanging at an angle. The roof had dents and tears, evidence of whatever had been up there trying to get in. I looked like I'd driven through a war zone. I called Tommy back, and he answered on the first ring. "Deirdre? Jesus, what's going on?" Your text scared the hell out of me. I tried to explain, tried to tell him about the shadowless figure and the toll and the things that came at midnight, but hearing it out loud made it sound insane even to me. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he just said, "Come home. Whatever happened up there, just come home and we'll figure it out." I promised him I would, that I'd drive straight back to Richmond and maybe stay with him and his family for a few days. But as I sat in that gas station parking lot, gathering the courage to get back on the road, I realized something that filled me with a cold, creeping dread. The thing had taken my memory of Ireland. Yes, I could feel the hole where it used to be, could sense that something was missing even if I couldn't remember what. But it had also left something behind. I could feel it in my head, a foreign presence, like a seed planted in soil. A piece of that place, just like it had promised. A piece of Raven's Crossing, of whatever dwelt there, now living inside me. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that it would grow, that it would whisper to me in quiet moments, would call to me in my dreams, would pull at me until eventually, maybe in months, maybe in years, I'd find myself driving back up that mountain, back to the trail, back to pay the rest of the toll I owed. Because you can't really escape a place like that. You can drive away, you can put miles between you and it, but if it's marked you, If it's taken root inside you, you'll always belong to it. I started my van and pulled back onto the highway, heading east toward Richmond and safety and the life I'd built. But in my rearview mirror, superimposed over the reflection of my own haunted eyes, I could swear I saw that shadowless figure standing at the edge of the gas station lot, watching, waiting, knowing I'd be back. So, this is the story of how a simple overnight stop in the Appalachians turned into the most disturbing experience of my life. I thought I was just parking my van in a quiet spot to save money on camping fees. But what I found in those mountains wasn't some scary legend or ghost story. It was real people doing things that still make me sick to think about. I've never told anyone the full truth about what happened that night, but I'm ready now. I'm Marlene Kowalski, 43 years old, and I've been living in Portland, Oregon for the past decade working as a freelance photographer. My whole life changed 6 months before this trip when I bought a 2015 Ford Transit and converted it into my mobile home. Nothing fancy, just a bed platform, some storage, and a portable stove. My best friend Hannah thought I was having a midlife crisis, but honestly, I just wanted freedom from rent and the chance to travel for work without burning through my savings on hotels. The plan was simple: drive cross-country, take photos of small-town America, sell them to magazines and stock photo sites, and live cheap while doing it. I'd been on the road for 3 weeks when I decided to cut through the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky. The GPS showed me taking the main highway, but I'm always looking for those hidden spots, you know? The places tourists don't see. So when I saw this unmarked dirt road branching off near a town called Harlan, I figured it might lead to some killer views for my portfolio. The road was rough, full of potholes and loose gravel, and my van handled it like a drunk person trying to walk a straight line. Trees crowded in on both sides, their branches forming this creepy tunnel that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. After about 20 minutes of bouncing along that horrible road, I came across this clearing. It was perfect, flat ground, a fire ring made of stones, and far enough from civilization that I wouldn't have to worry about cops telling me to move along. There was this old cabin maybe 50 yards away, completely falling apart with boards missing from the walls and no glass in the windows. Clearly abandoned for years, which meant no one would care if I crashed here for the night. I pulled my van into the clearing, killed the engine, and just sat there for a minute taking in how quiet everything was. Not peaceful quiet. I'm talking about that disturbing kind of silence where you realize you can't even hear birds. The sun was already starting to dip below the tree line, painting everything in this orange-red light that made the woods look like they were on fire. I grabbed my camera and walked around the clearing, snapping photos of the cabin and the way the light filtered through the trees. That's when I noticed the smell, faint, but definitely there. Kind of like when meat goes bad in your fridge and you don't realize it for a few days. I figured maybe a deer died nearby or something. Animals die in the woods all the time, right? I tried to ignore it and headed back to my van to make dinner. I had this routine down perfect by then. Boil water on my camp stove, add it to one of those dehydrated meal pouches, wait 10 minutes, and boom, instant food that tastes like cardboard but fills you up. While I was eating, sitting in the back of my van with the doors open, I saw this truck roll past on the main road I turned off from. It was moving slow, real slow, and even though it was getting dark, I could see it was old and beat to hell. The driver didn't have his headlights on, which struck me as weird, but not necessarily scary or anything. Country folks do things differently, I told myself. I finished eating, cleaned up my dishes using some wet wipes, and decided to do something stupid. I wanted to explore that cabin before it got completely dark. I'm a photographer, and abandoned buildings are like catnip to people like me. We can't resist them. So I grabbed my flashlight and my camera, locked up the van, and headed toward that creepy structure thinking I might get some horror-style shots for my portfolio. The cabin was even more disturbing up close than it looked from my van. The front door hung sideways on one hinge, and when I pushed it open, it made this long, drawn-out creak that probably alerted every living thing within a mile radius that I was there. Inside, the floorboards were so rotted that I had to test each step before putting my full weight down. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a single room with a collapsed bed frame in one corner, and a rusted wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used since the Carter administration. There were old newspapers scattered around, dated from 1987, and mason jars filled with God knows what lined up on a shelf that somehow hadn't fallen down yet. I was snapping photos, getting into that zone where you forget about everything except composition and lighting, when my foot went straight through a floorboard. I didn't fall or anything, just punched through up to my knee, but it scared the hell out of me. When I pulled my leg out, I noticed something weird in the hole I'd made. There was a space underneath the floor, like a crawl space or maybe a root cellar. And that smell I'd noticed earlier? It was coming from down there, stronger now, making my eyes water. I should have left right then. That would have been the smart thing to do. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and I convinced myself it was probably just a dead raccoon or possum that had crawled under there to die. I found a section of flooring near the back wall that was already loose, and I managed to pry it up with my hands. The smell hit me like a physical force, and I had to turn away and breathe through my mouth for a minute. When I finally looked down into that crawl space with my flashlight, I saw shapes wrapped in what looked like old tarps or plastic sheeting. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone used this place for storage. Maybe these were old camping supplies or farming equipment. But the shapes were wrong. Too specific. Too human-sized. I'm not an idiot, and I've seen enough true crime documentaries to know what I was probably looking at. But my mind just refused to accept it at first. That's when I heard the truck. Same one from before, I was pretty sure, because the engine had this distinctive rattle like something was seriously wrong with it. But this time it was close, really close, and I could see headlights now. They were on finally, sweeping across the clearing where my van sat like a giant advertisement that someone was here. My heart started doing this thing where it felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest. I killed my flashlight immediately and crouched down in the darkness of that horrible cabin, trying to think. The truck stopped. I heard a door slam. Then voices, 2 men, maybe 3, I couldn't tell. They were talking low, and I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong. Angry, aggressive, scary as hell. I stayed frozen there in the dark for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. The voices got closer to the cabin, and I realized with this sick, sinking feeling that they were coming to check it out. Of course they were. They probably knew about what was under the floor, and they'd seen my van, and now they were coming to deal with whoever was stupid enough to park here. I looked around desperately for another way out, but there was only the front door and one window that was too small to climb through. My phone was in my pocket, but when I checked it, I had 0 bars, no signal at all. I was completely alone with whatever was about to happen, and all I could think was how Hannah had been right, how this whole van life thing was a disturbing mistake, and how I was probably going to end up as one of those shapes wrapped in plastic under someone else's floorboards. I made a decision in about half a second that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to hide in the cabin where they'd definitely find me, I squeezed myself down into that crawl space through the hole I'd made in the floor. I know how that sounds, climbing down into what was basically a tomb, but sometimes the most disturbing choice is the only choice. I lowered myself as quietly as I could, my feet touching soft earth that felt wrong, too soft, and I tried not to think about what I might be standing on. The smell down there was absolutely horrific, like nothing I'd ever experienced, and I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from gagging. Above me, I could hear boots on the cabin floor, heavy footsteps that made dust and debris rain down through the cracks. There were 3 of them. I could tell by the voices now that I was closer. One sounded older, with this rough, smoky voice like he'd been chain-smoking since birth. He was clearly in charge, giving orders to the other 2. "Check the stove, see if it's warm," he said. "And look at them floorboards. Someone's been messing around here." I pressed myself against the earthen wall of the crawl space, trying to make myself as small as possible. My flashlight was off, obviously, but even in the darkness I could make out the shapes around me. They were bodies, at least 4 that I could see, wrapped in plastic and tarps, in various states of decay. I was literally hiding in a mass grave, and the people who put these bodies here were standing right above me. One of the younger guys, he sounded maybe mid-20s, started panicking. "That van out there. Virgil, someone's here right now. We gotta find him." Virgil, the older one, told him to shut up and think. "Phone don't work out here, so they ain't called nobody. Vehicle's still here, so they're on foot or hiding nearby. Probably took off into the woods when they heard us coming." There was a pause, And then Virgil said something that made my blood turn to ice. Or they found the cellar and got curious. "Bobby, get your ass down there and check." I heard footsteps moving toward the section of floor I'd pried up, and I knew I had maybe seconds before someone with a flashlight would be shining it right at me. I did the only thing I could think of. I crawled deeper into the crawl space, away from the opening, moving as slowly and quietly as possible. My hands touched things I didn't want to identify, and at one point my shoulder brushed against one of the wrapped bodies and I felt it shift slightly. I wanted to scream so badly that I had to bite down on my own hand to stop myself. The crawl space extended further than I expected, maybe running under the entire cabin, and I kept going until I reached what felt like the far wall. Then I heard Bobby drop down into the space where I'd been standing just moments before. His flashlight beam swept across the crawl space, and I pressed myself flat against the ground, not breathing, not moving, praying that the darkness and the bodies between us would hide me. Bobby was quiet for a long moment, and then he made this retching sound. "Jesus Christ, Virgil, it's worse than before. How many we got down here now?" Virgil's voice came from above. "Don't matter. What matters is whether our visitors saw anything. You see anyone down there?" Bobby swept his light around again, and I swear it passed right over me, but somehow didn't catch me. Maybe the angle was wrong, or maybe he was too freaked out by the bodies to look carefully. "Nobody here," he finally said. "But someone definitely opened this up recently. Dirt's all disturbed." They argued for a minute about what to do, and I heard the scary reality of my situation in their words. They were going to search the woods, find me eventually, and add me to their collection down here. Unless I could somehow get to my van first. Bobby climbed back up, and I heard them nailing boards over the opening I'd created, sealing me in with the dead. The hammering echoed through the crawl space, each blow like a nail in my own coffin, and I had to fight down the rising panic that threatened to make me scream. They were talking about splitting up. One would stay with my van in case I came back for it, while the other two would search the woods with flashlights and dogs. Dogs. They had dogs somewhere, probably back at their property, and they were going to get them. I had maybe 20 minutes, half an hour tops, before they came back with animals that would sniff me out no matter where I hid. I waited until I heard the cabin door slam and the truck engine start up before I moved. The sound of the vehicle fading into the distance was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard, but I knew at least one of them had stayed behind like they'd planned. I crawled back toward where the opening had been, feeling along the floorboards above me until I found a weak spot. The wood was so rotten in places that I managed to push through with my shoulder, creating enough space to squeeze up and out. When I emerged back into the cabin, gasping for air that didn't smell like death, I was covered in dirt and God knows what else, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight. Through the gaps in the cabin walls, I could see my van sitting there in the clearing, and sure enough, there was a man leaning against it smoking a cigarette. He was younger than Virgil, built like someone who did physical labor for a living, and he had a rifle propped against my driver's side door, just standing there, waiting, like he had all the time in the world. My keys were in my pocket. I always kept them on me, thank God, but they might as well have been on the moon for all the good they did me. There was no way I could get to the van without him seeing me, and even if I somehow managed it, he'd shoot me before I could get the engine started. I moved to the back of the cabin as quietly as possible and found a window that faced away from the clearing into the woods. It was small, but I thought I could fit through it if I really tried. The problem was that breaking out would make noise, and noise would bring Rifle Guy running. But I didn't have a choice. I couldn't stay here, and I couldn't go out the front door. So I used my flashlight to knock out the remaining shards of glass as quietly as I could, wrapped my jacket around my hands, and started to wiggle through. I got stuck halfway, my hips caught on the frame, and for a horrible moment I thought I was trapped. I could hear the guy out front cough, spit, shuffle his feet. If he decided to check the cabin right now, he'd find me hanging out a window like the world's worst burglar. I twisted and pushed and finally popped through, landing hard on the ground outside. Pain shot through my ankle. I'd landed wrong, but I didn't have time to worry about it. I could hear the guy walking around the van now, his footsteps crunching on gravel. I limped into the woods as fast as I could, trying to put distance between myself and that clearing. The forest at night is a different world, full of sounds that your imagination turns into threats. Every snapping twig was a footstep behind me. Every rustle in the bushes was someone closing in. My ankle throbbed with each step, and I knew I was leaving a trail that even an amateur could follow, but stopping meant dying. I had to keep moving, had to get far enough away that when they came back with the dogs, I'd have a head start. The disturbing truth was settling over me like a weight. I was being hunted, and these men had done this before. I stumbled through those woods for what felt like hours, my ankles screaming with every step, branches whipping my face and tearing at my clothes. I had no idea where I was going. I'd lost all sense of direction in the darkness, but I knew I needed to put as much distance as possible between me and that cabin. Eventually I heard it, the baying of hounds in the distance. They'd come back with the dogs just like they'd said, and those animals had my scent. The sound was getting closer, and I realized with this sick, hopeless feeling that I couldn't outrun them. Not with my injured ankle, not in terrain I didn't know, not against people who'd probably grown up in these mountains. I came across a creek, maybe 3 feet wide, water moving fast over rocks, and I remembered something I'd seen in a movie once about water hiding your scent from tracking dogs. I had no idea if it actually worked or if that was Hollywood nonsense, but I was desperate. I stepped into that freezing water and started walking downstream, using the creek bed like a path. The cold was shocking, numbing my feet and legs almost immediately, but it was better than being caught. I could still hear the dogs, but the sound seemed to be getting more distant, or maybe that was just wishful thinking. My teeth were chattering so hard I thought they might crack, and I knew hypothermia was a real possibility if I stayed in this water too long. After maybe 20 minutes of following the creek, I saw lights through the trees, not flashlights, but steady lights like from a building. I climbed out of the water and moved toward them, praying it wasn't Virgil's property or some other scary situation. As I got closer, I could make out a small house with a pickup truck parked outside, lights on in the windows. It looked normal, lived in, like regular people might be inside watching TV or eating dinner. I knew I was taking a huge risk. For all I knew, everyone in this area was connected, all part of whatever horrific operation was happening at that cabin. But I was out of options. I was freezing, injured, and being hunted. I had to take the chance. I knocked on the door, and when it opened, an elderly woman stood there looking at me like I was a ghost. I must have looked absolutely insane, covered in dirt, soaking wet, bleeding from a dozen cuts, wild-eyed and shaking. "Please," I managed to say through chattering teeth, "please help me. There are men with dogs, and they're trying to kill me." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw her eyes take in my condition, saw her make some kind of decision. Then she pulled me inside and locked the door behind us. "Harold," she called out. "Harold, get your gun and call the sheriff. We got a situation here." An old man appeared from another room, took one look at me, and immediately went for the phone. The sheriff arrived 40 minutes later with 3 deputies, and I told them everything. The cabin, the crawl space, the bodies, Virgil and his crew. They found my van still sitting in that clearing with the guard gone, probably scattered when the law showed up. It took them 2 days to excavate that crawl space, and they found 8 bodies total, all people who'd gone missing over the past 3 years in various parts of Kentucky and neighboring states. Hikers, campers, drifters, people whose disappearances didn't make national news. Virgil Turner and his 2 nephews were arrested at their property 5 miles from the cabin. They'd been using that land for decades, the sheriff told me, and God knows how many people they'd killed before they started using the crawl space. They found evidence of older burial sites scattered throughout those woods. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and I had to testify, had to relive every disturbing moment of that night. All 3 of them got life sentences without parole. I sold my van 2 months later, couldn't even look at it without feeling sick, and moved back into an apartment in Portland. Some people aren't meant for van life, I guess. Some people stumble into things they can never unsee, and the only thing you can do is try to rebuild something normal from the wreckage. I still have nightmares about that crawl space, about the smell, about what would have happened if those dogs had found me. But at least I'm alive to have nightmares. 8 other people aren't that lucky. This is about the time I thought I'd found the perfect hidden campsite in the Appalachian wilderness, somewhere off the beaten path in West Virginia. I was documenting abandoned coal mining towns for a photography project, and I figured staying in my van near one of these ghost towns would save money and give me that authentic, isolated feeling I was chasing. What I didn't know was that some places are abandoned for reasons that have nothing to do with economics, and some towns never really empty out. They just go underground. I'm Darius Bellamy, 38 years old, and I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee since I graduated college. I work as a freelance documentary photographer, which is a fancy way of saying I chase stories that don't pay much but matter to me. My brother Kendrick always said I should have gone into wedding photography like him. Steady money, happy clients, none of this artistic suffering nonsense. But I can't help myself. I'm drawn to decay, to forgotten places, to the stories that get left behind when progress moves on. That's what brought me to West Virginia in the first place. I'd spent 2 weeks driving through old coal country, photographing abandoned company towns with names like Thurmond and Nuttleburg. These places used to house thousands of miners and their families, but when the coal ran out or the companies shut down, everyone just left. Now they're rotting away slowly, reclaimed by the forest, and there's something beautiful and disturbing about that process. My plan was to turn all these photos into a book, maybe get it published by one of those small presses that actually care about documenting American decline. I know, real uplifting stuff, but somebody's got to remember these places existed. The van I was driving wasn't anything special. A 2012 Chevy Express I'd bought off Craigslist and converted myself with help from YouTube videos. Plywood bed platform, some plastic storage bins, a cooler for food, and that was basically it. No solar panels, no fancy electrical system, just bare bones camping on wheels. I'd been sleeping in it for 3 months straight, bouncing from location to location, and I'd gotten pretty good at finding spots where nobody would bother me. That's how I found the road that led to Carbondale, or what was left of it. I'd seen the town marked on an old mining map I'd picked up at a historical society in Charleston. Carbondale wasn't on any modern maps or GPS systems, which meant it had been abandoned long enough that the state had basically forgotten about it. Perfect for what I needed. The turnoff was barely visible, just 2 ruts in the grass where a road used to be, and I almost drove past it. But I caught it at the last second and turned onto what felt more like a hiking trail than an actual road. My van bottomed out twice on rocks, and tree branches scraped both sides with this horrible screeching sound that made me wince. After about a mile of this punishment, the forest opened up and I saw the town. Or the corpse of it, really. Maybe 20 buildings total, all wooden structures in various stages of collapse. There was a main street, just dirt now, no pavement, with houses on either side and what looked like a company store at the far end. Every window was broken, every door hung open or missing entirely, and vines had crawled up the walls like the forest was slowly eating the whole place. It was late afternoon, that golden hour photographers love, and the light hitting those decrepit buildings was absolutely perfect. I grabbed my camera and started shooting immediately, forgetting about everything else. That was my first mistake, getting so absorbed in the work that I stopped paying attention to my surroundings and the scary feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent maybe 2 hours photographing the town, moving from building to building, documenting everything. The company store still had shelves inside, empty except for some rusted cans and broken glass. One of the houses had a calendar on the wall from 1962, the pages yellowed and curling. Another had children's toys scattered across the floor, a wooden rocking horse with no paint left, a doll with its face worn smooth by time and weather. These details are what make the work meaningful, you know? They remind you that real people lived here, had routines and dreams and problems just like everyone else, before it all got abandoned. As the sun started dropping behind the mountains, I realized I needed to figure out where to park for the night. The main street felt too exposed, too open, so I drove my van down a side path that led to what looked like it used to be a maintenance area, probably where they kept equipment for the mine. There were a couple of large corrugated metal buildings here, one with its roof completely caved in and the other still mostly intact. I parked between them, figuring the structures would hide my van from anyone who might wander through, though honestly, I doubted anyone ever came out here. The place felt completely dead, forgotten by the world. I made myself dinner as usual, ramen noodles cooked on my little camp stove, and sat in the back of my van with the doors open, eating and watching the light fade. That's when I noticed the mine entrance. It was maybe 50 yards past the metal buildings, cut into the hillside, with old railroad tracks leading into it. The opening was partially collapsed, but there was still a gap, maybe 4 feet high that you could crawl through if you really wanted to. A chain-link fence had been put up at some point to keep people out, but it had been torn down or rusted away, leaving just twisted metal and a few posts. Warning signs were posted everywhere. Danger, unstable mine, keep out. Standard stuff you see at every abandoned mine in coal country. What wasn't standard was the light. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as it got darker, I could swear I saw a faint glow coming from inside that mine entrance. Not bright, just this dim, flickering light like from candles or maybe a fire burning deep in there somewhere. I told myself it was probably some chemical thing, gases or minerals that glow naturally, something scientific that had a boring explanation. Mines do weird things sometimes, especially old ones. But then I heard sounds coming from that direction. Voices, distant and echoey, like people talking far underground. My first thought was that maybe some kids had gone in there to party or explore, doing the same kind of stupid, dangerous stuff I probably would have done at their age. But something felt wrong about it. The voices had this quality that was hard to describe, rhythmic, almost like chanting, and there were too many of them. This wasn't a couple of teenagers with flashlights. This was a group, maybe a big one, and they were deep inside that mountain doing something that required a lot of people. I grabbed my flashlight and walked closer to the mine entrance, telling myself I was just curious, just documenting, that this was part of the story. The voices got clearer as I approached, and I could make out individual words now, though they didn't make much sense. They were speaking English, but using terms I didn't recognize, mixing in what sounded like another language entirely. And underneath the voices was this other sound, a rhythmic thumping, like hammers hitting stone, steady and methodical and deeply disturbing in a way I couldn't explain. I got within maybe 20 feet of that mine entrance before every instinct in my body started screaming at me to turn around. The glow was definitely real, not my imagination, and it was pulsing now in time with that thumping sound. Orange light, like firelight, but too steady to be just a campfire. The chanting had picked up in intensity too, multiple voices layering over each other in this disturbing harmony that made my skin crawl. I'm not a religious person, but the only word I could think of to describe what I was hearing was ritualistic. This wasn't people hanging out. This was people doing something they believed in, something organized and intentional. I pulled out my phone to record some audio, journalist instincts kicking in, but of course I had no signal out here. Still, the voice memo app worked fine, so I hit record and held the phone toward the mine entrance. That's when the sound stopped. Just like that, mid-chant, everything went silent. The thumping stopped. The voices cut off. Even the insects in the woods around me seemed to shut up all at once. It was that scary kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat pounding in your ears, where every breath sounds too loud. I stood there frozen, phone still recording nothing but silence, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was in that mine knew I was here. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off that entrance, watching for movement in the flickering light. My hand was shaking so badly, I almost dropped my phone. When I was maybe 30 feet away, I heard footsteps, not walking, running, coming from inside the mine. Multiple people, their boots echoing off stone walls, getting closer fast. I turned and ran back to my van, not caring how much noise I made, just focused on getting to safety. Behind me, I heard voices again, but not chanting this time. These were shouts, commands being given, and they were angry. Someone yelled, "Get him!" And that was all the motivation I needed to move faster than I'd ever moved in my life. I reached my van and jumped in the driver's seat, jamming the keys in the ignition with trembling hands. The engine turned over, thank God, and I threw it in reverse, backing away from those metal buildings as fast as I dared. In my rearview mirror, I could see shapes emerging from the mine entrance, at least a dozen people, maybe more. They were dressed in dark clothes, and several of them were carrying what looked like pickaxes and shovels. Tools, but also weapons if they wanted them to be. My headlights swept across them as I spun the wheel, and I got a glimpse of their faces, pale, dirt-streaked, with this intense, focused look that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with stopping me from leaving. I gunned it back toward the main street, my van bouncing violently over the rutted path, stuff flying around in the back. I heard something hit my rear window, a rock, maybe, or a chunk of wood, but the glass held. More impacts followed, a steady barrage of projectiles being hurled at my van by people who were now chasing me on foot. Some of them were fast, really fast, keeping pace with my van even as I accelerated. I reached the main street and turned hard, my tires slipping in the dirt, fishtailing before I got control back. In my side mirror, I could see the group spreading out, some still throwing things, others just standing there watching me flee. The disturbing part was their expressions. They weren't angry or scared or anything normal. They looked determined, purposeful, like this was just a minor setback in whatever they were doing down in that mine. I floored it down that excuse for a road, branches scraping the sides of my van, rocks hammering the undercarriage, not caring about the damage because all I could think about was getting out of Carbondale. But when I reached the spot where I'd turned off the main highway, I slammed on my brakes so hard I nearly went through the windshield. There was a truck blocking the exit, a big old Ford from the 70s, parked sideways across the narrow road. And standing in front of it were 3 more people in those same dark clothes, holding tools and flashlights, waiting for me like they'd known exactly where I'd try to go. I threw the van in reverse, but when I looked back, I saw headlights behind me. 2 more vehicles had come from somewhere, probably parked in the woods where I hadn't seen them, and they were blocking my retreat. I was boxed in, trapped between 2 groups of people who clearly didn't want me leaving. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. I grabbed my phone again, desperately checking for signal, and got 1 bar. 1 single bar that flickered in and out. I dialed 911 and put the phone to my ear, hearing it ring once, twice, then a voice. 911. What's your emergency? I'm trapped in an abandoned town called Carbondale, off Route 16 in West Virginia, I said, talking fast, knowing I might lose the signal any second. There are people here, a lot of them, and they're not letting me leave. I think the call dropped. No signal. I tried again, nothing. I looked up and saw the people from both groups walking toward my van slowly, deliberately, tightening the circle. Some of them were smiling now, and that was somehow more disturbing than anger would have been. They looked pleased, satisfied, like they'd successfully caught something they'd been hunting. I did the only thing I could think of. I aimed my van at the gap between the road and the trees on the left side, where the forest wasn't quite as dense. It was stupid and dangerous and probably wouldn't work, but sitting there waiting for them to drag me out of my van seemed worse. I revved the engine, building up RPMs, and then I hit the gas and yanked the wheel hard left. The van lurched forward, crashing through brush and small trees, bouncing violently as the tires found uneven ground. Something underneath scraped against a rock with this horrible tearing sound, but I kept going. Behind me, I heard shouting, engine starting, headlights swinging around to follow. I crashed through that forest like a drunk person driving a tank, hitting trees, getting stuck on stumps and rocks, then powering forward again. My van wasn't built for this. It was a street vehicle being asked to do off-road terrain, but somehow it kept moving. Branches shattered my passenger window, showering me with glass. The whole vehicle was making sounds it was never designed to make, grinding and clanking and screaming in mechanical agony. But ahead of me, through the trees, I could see moonlight on pavement. The highway. I was maybe 50 yards away from civilization, from safety, from a place where normal rules applied, and people couldn't just chase you through the woods with pickaxes. I burst out of the forest and onto Route 16, my van sliding sideways as the tires hit actual road again. A semi-truck blasted its horn at me as I nearly cut it off, the driver probably thinking I was drunk or having a medical emergency. I straightened out and accelerated, checking my rearview mirror to see if they were still following. The vehicles that had been chasing me stopped at the forest edge, their headlights pointing at the highway but not crossing onto it. They just sat there, idling, watching me speed away. It was like they had a boundary they wouldn't cross, some invisible line that separated their world from the normal one. I kept my foot on the gas until I reached the next town, a place called Beckley, and I pulled into the first police station I could find. The cops at Beckley PD looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I was covered in cuts from the broken window glass, bleeding from a gash on my forehead I didn't even remember getting, and I'm sure I sounded absolutely insane trying to explain what had happened. There's a group of people living in the mine at Carbondale, I kept saying. They tried to trap me. They chased me. You have to go check it out. The desk sergeant, this heavy-set guy with a mustache that belonged in the 80s, just nodded and took notes like he was humoring a crazy person. He asked if I'd been drinking or taking any substances. I told him no, Showed him the damage to my van, the broken window, the dents and scrapes all over it. Physical evidence that something had happened. They sent 2 deputies out to Carbondale the next morning, and I went with them. Stayed in my van while they investigated because there was no way I was setting foot in that town again. We drove in with full daylight and found absolutely nothing. No people, no vehicles, no signs of recent activity at the mine entrance. The deputies walked around for 20 minutes, checked a few buildings, and came back shaking their heads. Town's been empty for decades, one of them told me. Mines collapsed. Nobody could get in there even if they wanted to. You sure you got the right place? I insisted this was it, pointed to the exact spot where I'd been parked, where I'd seen the people emerge from the mine. But there was nothing, not even tire tracks or footprints. The deputy, who seemed more sympathetic, pulled me aside and suggested maybe I'd encountered some homeless folks camping in the area, that they might have been defensive about their space and scared me off. Happens sometimes in these abandoned towns, he said. People living off the grid don't want to be found. They probably cleared out when they knew police were coming. It was a reasonable explanation, one that made sense if you ignored all the details that didn't fit, the chanting, the ritualistic sounds, the organized way they'd boxed me in, the fact that they'd stopped at the highway like it was electrified. But I was tired and scared and starting to doubt my own memory, so I just nodded and thanked them for checking. I drove straight back to Nashville after that. Didn't stop except for gas and bathroom breaks. Made the trip in one shot, even though it took 14 hours. When I got home, my brother Kendrick came over and helped me assess the damage to my van. The undercarriage was trashed, oil pan cracked, exhaust system destroyed, suspension completely shot. The repair estimate came back at $8,000, more than the van was worth. I ended up selling it for scrap and buying a used sedan instead, something normal and boring that would never see anything more adventurous than a grocery store parking lot. I tried to edit the photos I'd taken at Carbondale, thinking maybe I could salvage something from the experience, but every time I looked at those images I felt sick. The audio recording on my phone was corrupted somehow, just static and weird electronic noise that hurt to listen to. I had no proof of what I'd experienced, nothing to show that it wasn't just some scary hallucination brought on by stress or carbon monoxide or who knows what. But I know what I saw, what I heard. There are people living in that mine, doing something they don't want the outside world to know about. Maybe they've been there since the town was abandoned, maybe longer. Maybe they're the reason it was abandoned in the first place. I spent weeks researching Carbondale online, trying to find some mention of it, some history that would explain what I'd encountered. I found almost nothing, just a brief notation in a 1963 geological survey that the mine had been permanently sealed due to safety concerns, and one newspaper article from 1961 about several miners who disappeared during a cave-in. No bodies ever recovered. The article mentioned that some families refused to leave even after the company pulled out, insisted their loved ones were still alive down there. Then nothing. The town just vanished from records, like someone had deliberately erased it. I'll never know the full truth about what's happening in that mountain, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Some stories don't need to be documented. Some places should stay forgotten. I'm done chasing decay and abandoned things. These days I shoot weddings with my brother, and I sleep a lot better at night.